objectives and then the outline. I think one of the keys from my standpoint is understanding that teat disinfectants are designed to disinfect the skin of the teat. I think that's really important. We want to disinfect the skin of the teat. They're not dishwashing solution. We really want to work on disinfecting the skin. And then, you know, how do we position pre-milking and post-milking teat disinfectants? What are they actually designed? They do function differently. Skin conditioners, in my mind, probably, you know, besides the droplet of disinfectant at the teat end, the skin conditioner on the teat is probably just as important on the post-milking side. And then at the end, we're going to talk about there's methods for evaluation of long-term and short-term. Something I spend a lot of time doing on a daily, weekly basis. I think this is really important, and hopefully it will become more routine that we are evaluating teats throughout the year. So when we do make changes, we can say that it was, you know, positive or negative. So when we think about pre-milking teat disinfectants, you know, and look at it from a standpoint, the idea is to kill bacteria, but the huge focus of pre-dip is on environmental mastitis causing organisms. So these are the organisms that will be on their teat after milking when they're out in the environment. So your E. coli, your streptococcus, your Klebsiella. That's the real goal, is killing them before we go into the milking process. And then, you know, third is loosen that organic matter. Again, they are a wetting agent, but that's not the point of using them. We really want to make sure that we kill the bacteria. So is it a requirement in the U.S.? It is in the PMO that teat shall be treated with a sanitizing solution just prior to the time of milking and shall be dry before milking. That is in the pasteurized milk ordinance that you are supposed to. They use sanitizing, but disinfect teats prior to milking. Not here to say, you know, we need to go out and tell people you have to disinfect, but like it is in the that we have to do it. This really came to light, especially when robots came on the market, because they had to provide some sort of disinfection of the teat prior to milking. So by following this, so the pre-milking teat disinfectants are designed to meet what the PMO said. So again, if we talk about bacterial reduction in time, I get this question a lot, like how important is it that I reduce the bacteria count in 15 seconds or 30 seconds or 60 seconds? I'm going to sit up here and tell you that the time doesn't matter. It's what the bacteria count is when we're done, right? So the whole thing in most situations is we want at least 1,000 time reduction in the bacteria. So the take home on this is the less bacteria on the teat when we start, the less there are in the end. I don't get caught too much up into this 15, 30-second kill rates, because in most situations on dairy farms, it's rare that we have a milking routine that with after 15 seconds of putting the disinfectant on, we're going to take it off and put the milk. So it's not really a big player from that standpoint. There's some other things we'll talk about that I think are more important to killing bacteria than necessarily time. We really want to make sure that we give proper contact time for the disinfectant to work and reduce that bacterial load. The largest portion of bacteria in raw milk comes from the skin, actually. And I put this up here, and this is why I think that, you know, the process of disinfecting the teat along with cleaning is super important. That process of cleaning where we're going to remove organic matter, some skin, things like that. Super important to reducing that bacterial load on the teat at the time of milking. So the primary goal of post-dips, again, here is to kill bacteria, maintain and improve skin condition, but the main focus of post-dip is on contagious mastitis organisms. So the contagious ones that live in the udder, like Staph aureus, strep ag, mycoplasma, these organisms that would be in the milk residue that's on the skin of the teat after milking, we want that disinfectant there to kill the bacteria and then have a droplet at the teat end that's there until the teat canal closes. How long does it take the teat canal to close after proper milking? It takes 30 to 60 minutes for the teat canal to completely close if we milk them properly. If we over milk, where we leave the milking units on way too long, we're talking about open teat canals for like 1 to 8 hours. So that's the importance of the droplet, but maintaining or improving skin condition. This is a huge one. I think it's really, really important that we understand that, yes, we're talking about a concentration of a certain disinfectant on the post-milking side, but the skin condition is just super, super crucial here to prevent. It seems like there's a progression. As we start getting dry skin, then it leads to cracks and open lesions. And things become worse and worse. And then we have bacteria colonizing this. We have decaying of skin, necrosis, things like that. So again, control the contagious, and then exfoliate excessive dead teat skin. We're going to talk about this. Big discussion in the industry about truly if it exfoliates. From the standpoint of exfoliating skin, pH is what drives the rate of cell turnover. So the lower we get the pH, the faster the skin tissue turns over. So that's why with lactic acids, chlorine dioxides, we'll tend to see more sloughing of the skin, and that's because they tend to be lower pH disinfectants. Okay, so what's in a teat dip? You know, we have the germicide. That is our antimicrobial. That's the iodine, the chlorine dioxide, chlorhexidine. Surfactant, which is our wetting agent, that is designed for some, penetrating of the organic matter, but it's not the same type of surfactants that we see like with detergents. Okay, complexing agents to keep them, together, and then the skin conditioners, sealants, carriers, colorants, all of this. I bring this up because these have a huge impact on how, not only how the dips function, their interactions with the teats, but then when we start talking about different application methods, right? If you think about it, on how many farms today are we actually applying teat dip with a dip cup? Pretty well, maybe I shouldn't say that farms. How many cows are having dip applied with a dip cup? Probably not the majority, right? So we're talking about having to pump it through lines, potentially make foam, mix it with water, things like that, complexing it on farm. That's where I think understanding these different components of the dip is really important, because they can have a huge impact on the outcome of the product on the farm. So skin conditioners, and I'm really going to focus on skin conditioners. We really don't make emollients. That's been a word we use a lot. We really don't make an emulsion when we do these. And an emollient is more of a form, in all honesty, of a skin conditioner. But we can talk about the different types of skin conditioners. Probably like lanolin, glycerin are the key ones that we tend to see. But the idea, I think, is understanding how they work. So if we take occlusives, which would be some of our oils like lanolin, the whole idea there is that they create a barrier and they reduce evaporative loss or water loss. So when would be a good time that we would want to prevent water loss? Winter, right? We have drier conditions, so if we can hold the water to the teat, keep it there on the skin, should be less risk of drying. When we look at humectants, these are our water magnets, so they're going to pull moisture in. So this would be a target if you were going to switch. Like this would be the summertime in humid environments. We want to pull moisture out of the environment, keep it on the teat. Emollients more about decreasing skin roughness. So this is kind of a whole, more of like a viscosity thing on the layer of the skin. And then we have exfoliants, which this is basically, I talked about like low pH. This talks about softening the glue. That low pH basically increases the rate at which the cells turn over. So I do think, and we'll have some discussion here, could be a little bit of a target for low pH dips this time of the year. If we have dry skin, let's kind of get that all turned over and start out fresh and anew. And we'll talk about that. So what role does pH play in the development of disinfectants? Low pH does lead to more stable product storage. What's the issue with low pH, though, from the teat side? Yeah, it's an irritant, right? Very irritating to the cow when we get into really low, and also very irritating when we get very high. So what's out there that's a high pH that people use for disinfectant? Anybody have farms that use bleach or chlorine, right? Yeah. It's not recommended. Actually, can get into the whole labeling because it's labeled as a sanitizer. It's not designed to be used on the skin of animals, but again, it's very cheap, right? That's why a lot of farms use it. It's cheap. So again, just looking at the different range, chlorine dioxide, the lactic acids would be on the low side. Your bleach, your sodium hypochlorite would be on the high side for the pH. Iodine is more in the middle, 5 to 8. But, you know, we balance a fine line on everything when we talk about it. If we get much above an 8, we can actually take iodine from the complex to break it apart into 2 negative charges, which then it's not a disinfectant at that point. You know, and it was kind of like in the discussion earlier when I got here about, can water temperature be too high for wash? And I think somebody said like 190. At 170 degrees, we can bake proteins, and at 180, we actually vaporize chlorine. So we walk these fine lines in the industry. It doesn't matter if it's on the wash side, on the chemical side. We got to keep things very stable. You know, from that standpoint, I took it out, but again, as we all know, storage is a big thing, making sure they don't freeze, as well as in direct sunlight. You know, that's obviously why we have different colored barrels, things like that. So the active ingredient is the germicide. I think the thing to understand here is germicides have different quenching ability. And this is basically, if you think about quenching your thirst, right? You had the thirst and you drink water, so now you've ended the thirst. The quenching idea is the same way with disinfectants. As we quench the disinfectant or basically bind it with organic matter, we render it useless. There's no disinfectant left. Some disinfectants, based on their chemical makeup, have a lower or a higher quenching ability. So like iodine, chlorine dioxide, very strong in the side of that they're not weakened by organic matter. Hydrogen peroxide on the other side is a dip that if you have disinfectant, that if you have a farm with very dirty teats, I would not recommend it because they're going to get very little active ingredient that's still active when it comes in contact with the skin. Classes of germicides, just to understand, almost everything that we work with is an oxidative agent. There's a few non-oxidative, but basically when we think about this, the oxidizing, here, just quickly, when we think about bacteria and a single cell organism, the whole thing with an oxidative organism is that the cell wall is made up of protein, but it's amino acids. These oxidizers actually remove an electron from the amino acid of the bacteria in the cell wall, and then basically that cell wall falls apart. So we kill the bacteria. That's how they work. It's actually a pretty simple process. The only non-oxidative one that we really work with is chlorhexidine. Similar, again, mode of action, but it's just a cell wall disruptor. So it doesn't allow the movement of water and nutrients in and out of the cell, and it basically kills the bacteria. But these oxidative ones, and I think understanding how they work, like they have to come in contact with the bacteria to remove the electron to destroy the bacteria. If we bind it all up with manure or bedding, then that's how these bacteria counts remain higher on the teat during milking. I haven't updated this in probably 5 or 6 years, but just to show, it's probably might be a little bit different now. I think iodine potentially could be a little bit lower, but iodine probably still is somewhere around that 60% to 2/3 of the market share. We see a lot of it. I think a few things long term could impact that. One being the price, the other being if we ever get in competition with the medical field, the animal side is going to lose out very quickly. Iodine as a disinfectant, though, is actually not the major way that we use iodine. There's other ways in brines and other industries that it's used more, but it's still a big part of our industry from the standpoint of providing a healthy animal and a quality product. Just a table I put in here because you guys will get these slides in the end, just to kind of look at iodine is still the most broad spectrum. It kills more bacteria, fungi, algae than any of the other ones. So I think that's still why it's at the top of the spectrum. Probably the next most common that I see is chlorine dioxide. From the room here, what do we think are some benefits, some challenges with chlorine dioxide? It's a two-part system, right? Or three, correct. Yeah. And this becomes a bit, and I'm going to talk about this because I know it's here, but I'm going to talk about this in the end because we're seeing way more on-farm mixing. And I think it adds a whole nother level to making sure that we're not only, that we're monitoring the concentration of these disinfectants, and as well as it's another piece of equipment. That's been the big drawback to chlorine dioxide, but I think one of the major benefits of chlorine dioxide, at least on the pre-dip side, is chlorine dioxide is actually very cheap to make, very inexpensive. So it's something most chlorine dioxides that are on the market, because they're low pH, which leads to cell turnover, run very high skin conditioner packages, and that's usually where the expense comes in on those. But the two-part and then the short shelf life has kind of historically been the challenge. I do think we will see more and more of this with the automated mixing on farm. Barrier dips. Want to just put this in here. Kind of a seasonal topic. Barrier dips, there's no agreed upon definition, but basically when we look at it, there's an acrylic or a water soluble polymer that's applied to the skin of the teat. Barriers were designed for out in the western US on the dry lots in the rainy season where cattle were outside. They didn't have really a lot of access to shade, so conditions would become muddy, wet. We know when teats got wet and there was mud and it dried, we then had cracking of the teat skin. That's where barriers were designed. Barriers, in my experience, and growing up in the Midwest and working in the Northeast, I don't see a lot of areas where we benefit from them. Some of the issues, especially with the use of like manure solids, sawdust, barrier dips are very wet and tacky for a long time. Cows go back to the environment, everything sticks to it. So we're bringing in organic material that then sticks to the teat, can lead to actually teat health issues down the road. The other thing is, we'll talk about it a little bit when I get to foam, but because of the viscosity of barriers, they don't have good capillary action, which means it doesn't travel very far into the teat canal when we apply the post-it. I think that's been some of the challenges with them long term. You will hear that people have barriers that are quick drying, but they still remain very tacky. I've always been in the boat of we can use the same teat disinfectant with the same amount of skin conditioners and do just as well without a barrier as with in the Northeast, the Midwest. I think when you head out west and we do have rainy season, and we need to have that polymer around the skin to protect from the drying of like mud on there. I do think there is a way. I don't think we get into situations, we can discuss it if we think there's a spot for these. So again, pre and post dip, just talking about, typically we're a lower concentration of disinfectant on the pre side, low skin condition. And then post dips, again, higher concentration because we have a milk load on the skin of the teat. And we all know that milk is a great food source for bacteria. So we want to make sure we kill that. So that's why we're at higher concentration. And it's a longer time until they come back into milk. So we want a little bit higher concentration of disinfectant. Okay, teat dip coverage and methods of application. Anybody here ever done a towel test? A couple people? I did them the other day in a robot. What do you think I found? Great use of dip for coverage, right? This is always a challenge, and it's not just with spraying, but one of the challenges with spraying, and I bring this up because if we have spray as a post disinfectant for the method of application. We typically don't get good coverage this dish. That means we got teat dip all the way around. This one I can probably tell you is manual spraying where the milkers are walking by. Even with automated spraying, you will see that they tend to do better on one side of the teat versus the other, something like that. I think this is really important, though, when we're talking about overall skin condition, because if we have skin conditioners and we're not getting it on the teat, it's hard to have a discussion about having proper skin condition or like blame it on the skin conditioner package, the disinfectant, when we don't actually get it on there. Foam. I'm a huge fan of foam as a pre-dip. I think there's a few drawbacks when we get to the post-dip side. We'll talk about them. But the whole idea behind foam was to reduce your chemical usage when it came out, right? What are the challenges with foam today, though? Consistency is huge. It even amazes me in a parlor. Just take a double 20 where we have two foamers. We ever see where both of them are the same? Right? One could be more liquid, one could be more like shaving cream, whatever. But for me, the bigger issue is actually teat coverage. So the foam's not filling the reservoir equally, so we're getting it more on one side. Yeah, that could be part of it. I actually think the majority of this is when the milkers actually make contact with the teat. That's when they know to dip. So they go up, they come down, and there's nothing here. Absolutely nothing. These are these two pictures here on the right are from a farm that post dips with foam, as well as the use of manure solids. But we had over 82% of cows in that herd were classified with dry skin. And I do think it's something that if we would go to a liquid dip, even with like thrifty dipper brushes, if we're talking about, staying at the same usage, we can improve skin condition. So that's been one of the challenge is that I see. I love foam on the pre-dip side, but again, you still have the same challenge of making sure that we cover all surfaces, right? So things to look at. The towel test, if you go out and do it, is a great way to show people, that we're not hitting all the skin surfaces. So teat health and the environment, just talking about a few things here. Cold and wind. Wind's the big thing when we get cold. More important than cold alone, it's the wind, because the wind basically is bringing cold air by that teat. But when we have wet teats and we go out when it's cold and windy, that ends up leading to frostbite. So how many people work with farms that, typical, at least Midwestern, Northeast, where the farm is expanded over time? And we have an outdoor walkway, right? It's real world, but it's a challenge, And I think that's where we really get into these situations in the winter with conditions or with poor teat health. It's really minimizing the direct wind contact with the teat, I think, is the key. Probably many of you have seen, there's all kinds of these charts out there, but if you look at it, when we look at frozen teats will occur and we look at, air temperature, we don't have to be very windy. 15-mile-an-hour winds, we can cause frostbite on the teats. What do we do in these situations? I don't think there's a cure here. There's powdered dips. Some people stop dipping. I don't know if that's proper. Some people dip and then blot the teats dry. Again, just realize that if you have situations where cows are walking outside, I think the take home from this would be the drier the teat when the cow goes out, the better. So we know that we have an increase in dry skin over the winter, just like we do in humans, so do cows. The concern with frostbite, definitely see it more in fresh cows. And doesn't matter, even more in heifers than cows, but it's all because of edema, poor circulation. We tend to see more frostbite. So those are the animals you really want to make sure that if we have an opportunity, we really want to make sure they're not the ones that have to go out into the windy conditions if it's cold. Again, the whole thing here, talking about this, about, the edema, but leading into teat shape. We can do some genetic selection on this. We do know that Pointed teats are more prone to hyperkeratosis. And then I think it just all really goes downhill from there. Short teats, we also have increased issues with um, increased firmness or open teat canals after milking because the teat never engages the barrel of the liner to relieve congestion. You know, and in the end, I think the main question here about skin condition is why are we really concerned about it? And it's as we talked about in the beginning, we know that as we go from dry skin to cracks, open lesions, bacteria colonize, live in these cracks. If we do a poor job of post-dip coverage, so we didn't get skin conditioner, we still have milk residue. We're just promoting the growth of the bacteria. They actually start eating the tissue, breaking down, the lesions become worse. It's just a downhill spiral. Teat evaluation. This is something that's out there. There's a group of scientists from around the world that years ago formed a group called the Teat Club International, and they put together a paper that basically was the evaluation of teat skin condition related to non-infectious. So we're not talking about like herpes, mammalitis, or pseudocowpox. We're talking about things that would be from the environment, related to conditions with, you know, the winter, you know, the environment. We can talk about it, the impact of bedding and bedding additives, what that can do to teat skin. So looking at different ways, but we can evaluate the teats. And I think this is something that's really important is to go out and find out, you know, at least a couple times a year, evaluate the health of the teat so you know year over year what's typical. I mean, if you get brought in right now and the teats look horrible, you're like, well, what's going on? But they may be that way every year at this time. So I think it's important to go out and do these evaluations. So skin condition, these were, again, we've kind of talked about these, but these are the different levels. I just wanted to put it in you. This is all in a document that you could use to evaluate teats, but what we're looking for, obviously, is just normal skin, not dry, cracked, open lesions. There are a few papers out there, or a paper, it's not cup up anymore, but I just wanted to put this in here, of proven dips that have underwent evaluation by third-party independent research institutions to say, as we compare one dip to the other, it's either the same or better. I think that's important to have that information so that you can show your clients that, hey, we have a proven disinfectant. Okay, concentrated dip mixed on farm. I know this is something that Agrichem works on. It's a big part of it. I am fully on board with it. I think this is one of those where, you know, less is more in terms of what we take to the farm. We can create more dip. I think it's great. The one thing, as somebody who works with equipment, we just have to realize too that it's another piece of equipment that we have to evaluate, right? For me, and I know we heard this earlier, Emma, I heard you say it, there's a huge issue with not only the bacteria count, but the hardness of water when we're mixing on farm, right? So we got to make sure we're taking that into account and doing all our homework up front. That's kind of the take home on it. Again, we want to disinfect the teat, not the dirty water that came into the, you know what I mean? We're wasting it that way. And then the ability to titrate proper concentration of dip if mixing on farm. That's the easy part. What's the one part you can't titrate on farm? Yeah, the skin conditioners, Mike, you're right. That's a huge complex, has to go to a toxicology lab to try and figure out the skin conditioner. Whole point on that, fully on board with doing it on farm, but just do something simple and make sure if you know that they need to use X amount per batch, we know how many cows, we can quickly figure out on a weekly basis, we should go down 3 gallons in the barrel or whatever. Make a market so we know. Something that simple, just to have a check that we're putting in the proper amount of the skin conditioners. This is a farm that I work with that actually is manually mixing the teat disinfectant with the skin conditioner on farm. And when I got there that morning, it's fairly early, the owner wasn't there yet, and the cows, every time they clapped, were clicking at their teats. I opened this barrel and I saw that there was this huge suspension. Something wasn't mixing right. And I put my gloved hand in and there was this gel. Watch these cows. So what do you think happened here? They actually used the right formula for mixing. They used the wrong product because when barrels got delivered to the farm, chlorinated CIP got put right next to the sodium hypochlorite. It's not the milker's fault that this happened. So they had basically chlorinated CIP solution mixed with the surfactant, and this is what happened. This is my challenge with the and I think the next one. This is the same, another farm. This is one where they were undergoing construction and everything got moved. They had everything separated where CIP was on one side, Teat dips were on the other. They all got moved together and they went out. And again, it was the same situation. This one was actually an acid that got put into the dip cups. And you can see on the right, the perfect droplet that they had on these cows from their dipping and just burned the teats. And then it led to these open lesions over time. Point here is on-farm mixing I'm fully on board with, but if we're going to do it, we got to make sure stuff is labeled properly. I like color coding things, you know, so they know, like we always go to the pump with red on it or green on it. So if it's something gets delivered wrong, you still know that it has to have the right color pump or something in it or be marked. So just kind of lastly here, I talked about this in the beginning, but iodine in the last 5 years is more than doubled. And I think this is, I got asked by a veterinarian last week about should we be looking at other alternatives. And the interesting thing is the farm owner was sitting there too. And he's like, man, he goes, it would only take 1 or 2 cases though of mastitis to lose that savings on another dip. You know what I mean? So, but I think it's here. And I actually, this was from the last quarter of 2022. It's actually went up significantly more since then. So I think this is a discussion that's on the table when we talk about teat disinfectants. And I think, you know, ultimately, so what is the best teat dip? Whatever Chip's selling. All right. You know, correct. And I think that's the last one on here. We can talk about cell count, all that, but you know, what's the goal of your client? What really is their goal? And it could be at the time they're having an issue with, you know, poor skin condition. So how do we improve poor skin condition? Well, maybe through parts of the year, we have to go to a winter dip. We have to go from 10% skin conditioners up to 50%. I see that fairly routinely throughout the year now. Anybody here work with farms that use manure solids? Anybody see dry skin issues? There's definitely a wicking effect from the manure solids that's pulling moisture away from the teat and causing dry skin. We're actually seeing dry skin like we would see in the winter year round, and it's making it even worse in the winter. So I have some farms that we routinely run for a week throughout the year. For 1 week, we'll run a winter dip with 50% skin conditioners, and then like the next 3 weeks, we're just back to 10%. And that's enough to keep it there. But if we just stay at 10%, it's not enough. Maybe we get to the point where we're running, you know, 15 or 17% year round with manure solids because that's what we can do to maintain that skin condition. The other one on that side too are bedding additives. Not all, but most bedding additives that we see have a high pH. High pH, when we look at lime, also dries the skin. You know, so those are all things to keep in mind. So I think in final discussion here, the real take home is to disinfect the skin of the teat. And I think we talked about the winter, coming out of the winter, you know, what can we do I think, really to hit that when we talk about disinfecting the skin of the teat is we want to keep that teat healthy year round. I think there's two ways I look at skin condition. One is how do we help or improve it? And that's our skin conditioners, right? The second one is when we get into situations where we have poor skin condition, what can we do? I do think there is a time to target potential dips that have a low pH that can exfoliate the skin, speed up that process to get us to a new layer of skin. It's not something that I'm saying I would do necessarily year round, but I do think that if we get into a situation where the teat health is bad, we know we're coming out of environmental conditions that were poor and we're getting into better conditions, that would be the time to say, let's go into this farm, let's go with some low pH chlorine dioxide. You can go with all kinds of different lactic acids that are out there, potentially speed up the sloughing of the skin and then start a new, maybe you do it for 2 weeks. We even see it, I didn't talk about it much, but we even see it if you really look at hyperkeratosis. The keratin that gets removed in the winter actually gets very dry and cracked, where throughout the rest of the season it's more rounded and soft. And I think that's also a huge difference in how much bacteria can be harbored within the dryness and the cracks of the keratin. The same thing there. Coverage of the entire teat surface. Again, think skin conditioners when we think post-dip. Multiple skin conditioning packages. I think there's benefits to that. And then application method, thinking about a dip cup versus foam versus spraying in terms of how are we getting the most coverage of the teat. I think evaluate, teat health on a routine basis, and then, make sure when you're going in and working with your client, if they've got something in there that you've never heard of, look into it, but show them that you have, proven disinfectants that they can use. So, with that, I will take any questions.
So the first question is, if you reduce the concentration of pre-dip, what is the biggest risk?
So if we reduce the concentration of the pre-milking disinfectant, I'll be honest, I guess, somewhat it depends on what we're working with, but I think my big question here is what is overall like teat cleanliness of the animal coming in? I think if I was in a situation where we had very dirty teats, I wouldn't want to reduce it. If they were cleaner, we could. Anybody work with farms that actually changes the concentration? Like they run lower levels in the summer and higher in the winter. I'm fine with that if teats are clean and healthy. Again, it's the first thing though, like if there's an issue with overall teat health or milk quality and we see a low concentration, it might be something you have a discussion about. But if they're doing everything right, I don't think lowering it, again, I don't know what disinfectant we're talking about and what starting concentration. For iodine, for example, typically we're at a 0.5% on the pre-milking side, and we're usually at 1% on the post-milking side. I've seen the pre-milking sign down at 0.25%. I mean, I think people can do it. I'm not saying go there, but you got to know the farm, right? And know the situation. It would absolutely, yeah, absolutely. We're talking heat stress, which in that, so increasing it then I do think could be beneficial. I think the biggest thing you have there though is you're talking that you're using cooling ponds. So we're obviously adding moisture to the environment, which is great for growing bacteria, but the cooling of the animal, that benefit far outweighs the added water to growing bacteria to keep their immune system healthy. I do think you could potentially increase it there, maybe see a benefit, but again, it's the whole, are these cows any dirtier? I mean, if they're dirtier, then I think there would be somewhat of an advantage.
The question was to up the emollients or to make the chlorine dioxide stronger from the audience.
So we're on the post-dip side. So what are you running, like 1,000 ppm or what? 1,200? That's typical. So you're asking about going to 1,500 or 1,600? Like that's kind of the, and then 2%. And so they're in free stalls? What are they bedded with? Sand. I'll be honest, I would absolutely increase the skin conditioner. Yes. Just given the challenges and being only at 2%, I think there would be a benefit of taking that up.
The question from the audience was, would the barrier dissolve right when it hits the pond?
I think if they didn't have adequate drying time, that could be an issue. Because when we talk about most of the polymer that's in the barrier, we're looking at close to 10 minutes for that to properly dry. I think if they achieve, I think if they achieve that, we keep them, stand and get them to feed before they go there. Shouldn't be.
So first question from Chad is, can barrier packages harm teat conditions or create lesions based on temperatures, or if some is left on when the milking unit is attached?
So there's definitely a concern with barriers, and when the cows come into the parlor, it is a challenge for the milking staff to clean that polymer off, right? That becomes a real challenge. Can it actually harbor? So the thing you have to remember, in the barrier, there's also a disinfectant, right? So the disinfectant should kill the bacteria that's on the teat, and then basically that polymer is formed afterwards. Can't say for a fact. I can't see a situation where I would believe that a barrier itself would make the situation with open lesions worse as compared to the same type of disinfectant with the same amount of skin conditioner, is just non-barrier. I don't think it's going to hold bacteria in, because again, if we form that acrylic layer, it's going to hold out some of the environmental conditions potentially on the lesion. But I think more important is figuring out what's causing the lesions and focusing on that.
Okay, second question from chat is, how does an iodine interact with environmental? Does it bind it up?
Yeah, so iodine, being an oxidizing agent, basically interacts by disrupting the cell wall of the bacteria. That's what we talked about being an oxidizer. It basically goes in and removes an electron from the protein or the amino acid breakup and makeup of the cell wall. And ultimately, the bacteria basically it just falls apart. It can't maintain itself after we remove the cell wall. So we've basically rendered that bacteria useless at that point.
And kind of the second part to that question is, can you explain how free iodine versus bound iodine in a teat dip works?
I'm not going down that road. It's different complexing, and there's two different ways of titrating it based on the way the iodine is complexed. And manufacturers do it differently. You just got to make sure you're using the acid method on one and not on the other, but that information's out there.
If you use 0.25%, 0.5%, or does it need to be 1% is the question for follow-up from the audience.
From the standpoint of, I don't think it matter. I mean, I think it depends on if we're talking like pre-milking or post-milking and like our concentration. Yeah, because we're talking different total ppm of iodine at each concentration. So we do have more killing power because it's 10,000 ppm versus 5,000 versus 2,500. What do you think about that?
The question from the audience was using foamers for pre and post. For chlorine dioxide.
Yeah, so I like foamers on the pre-milking side. I think they give you more surface area for the milking staff to have to physically work and clean. As I showed earlier, my concern on the post-dipping side is if we don't have the proper the proper makeup, the viscosity of the dip, and then we don't get adequate coverage on the teat. At least on the pre-milking side, we have a towel coming through afterwards to help with the cleaning. We don't have that on the post side when it goes back out. So that would be my concern, as I showed earlier.
The question was, is the same strength using the foamers as the air?
Yeah, so I think the question is the foam the same disinfectant concentration as a liquid because we're adding air to it? It is, yes. Yep. And again, remember the whole idea when foam came out was just to reduce dip usage, but I can tell you, I took the slide out. You better make sure you know what you're using, because I've seen situations where we've used very viscous dips and we foamed them, and we've actually used more dip than if we used it as applied it as a liquid.
So you mentioned the water quality aspect of mixing on farm. How do you propose to combat that, or do you feel that the concentration of the dip is okay without combating it?
I think it's super important to know what the quality of the water is when you're mixing on farm. It's no different when we talk about wash systems, right? Because if we have hard water, we have to use more detergent, things like that. It's the same with the dip, depending upon the hardness. But I think the other one to keep in mind is actually the bacteria count, right? So we know that in most water tests only provide you a coliform count, but we know that in certain wells that will have Pseudomonas, things like that. So I think it's really important to have a full bacterial culture done on your water, as well as know the hardness. So you can actually, I'm in the boat of, if you have these situations, sometimes it's not always pre-treating water, but sometimes it might be as simple as filtration. Just remove some stuff so the water's cleaner than when you're using it to mix your on-farm concentrate to make your solution. Why are we concerned about the bacteria count in the water? Because you're using up your disinfectant just in the water before it's going to the cow. So it's the whole, from the standpoint, you're going to require more at the farm. Correct. Yes. And you may have to actually, to get the proper concentration, if you're doing the titration, you have to run it higher.
All right, that is the end of our question and answer, and also the end of the webinar. We want to thank Dr. Waters for coming in. All really incredibly valuable information. A recording is going to be made available of this webinar online, and for everyone in the audience here, you'll be able to access this in a few days. So keep an eye on your email inbox. We'll be sending it to you soon. Thank you.